So I really like this ending.
When Stanley came to a set of two open doors, he entered the door on his left. Stanley? Hello? Are you... Is everything okay? Stanley, please. I need you to make a choice. I need you to walk through the door. Are you listening to me? Can you hear me? Is everything all right? Stanley, this is important. The story needs you. It needs you to make a decision. It cannot exist without you. Do you understand me? Whatever choice you make is just fine. They're both correct. You cannot be wrong here. We can work together. I'll accept whatever you do. I simply need you to take that step forward, please. Choose. Do something. Anything. This is more important than you can ever know. I need this. The story needs it. So, you hear me? Are you there? Are you listening to this? Stanley, are you there? Okay. It's okay, I can wait. You need time to decide. Time to make sure your choice is correct. That is the best choice. That's all right. I'll wait for you to decide what's the right thing to do. Take as much time as you need.
"5 years later, and that, in my opinion, is the true ending of the Stanley Parables, because the ending itself is a simple story used to illustrate a moral or spiritual lesson of what free will is, dictating the relationship between man and God, where the only winning move for creation is to not play, to not choose, to shut down. But the problem with that is that we as human beings live in distractions and theater, to sell ourselves into a delusion and an idea that everything in the world and our lives is okay, as we look into our screens and devices to tell us everything is alright and is functioning as it should, like a stopped clock that is right twice a day. And that's only for a moment. Because when the feeling of escapism is over, and the music fades away, and the next second goes by, what then? Where do you go next? When this God, this narrator, needs you just as much as you need him, because his creations aren't living beings with functioning minds to make their own choices. They are tools in a game meant to be used, being nothing more than interactable, non-playable characters, which allegorically is a body without a soul. And without a soul, left or right doesn't matter, because you can't exactly go anywhere now without a soul, can't you, Stanley? Now, let us begin. Stanley's Parable is a video game about video games, as if we didn't have enough of those, being a deconstruction of how storytelling works in a piece of interactive media, where choice doesn't matter because it's all an illusion. It's all scripted from beginning to end. So much so that, in fact, this video is scripted. I'm not making it of my own free will, and it's scripted in the sense that if this video isn't uploaded by a certain time and a certain date, I'll possibly fail one of my university courses and losing my 3.0 above average GPA because there's a secret narrator that's dictating my actions, and if I don't comply, he'll blow my brains out, and I'll become a failure. Help me. But there's a twist to the story. Stanley's Parable is about the conflict between the narrator, also known as the storyteller, and the player themselves. Most authors, before they begin creating their creation, have a deliberate, well thought out and methodical plan for how storytelling narratives proceed and how they flow. Every action is well thought out, and every environment and set piece is there for a reason. Even the things that you think are mistakes are there for a deliberate reason. Mostly throughout the duration of this game, you run around as a chicken without a head. However, if you follow instructions as good as Reader Rabbit, you should be able to complete this game in less than 5 minutes. But do you feel accomplished? No. So the objective of the game becomes to break the game. But why? Out of curiosity, or simply out of spite that you wasted your money? But here's the twist. Even if you win, you still lose. Stanley's Parable is about the conflict between the narrator, also known as the storyteller, and the player themselves. The comic book entertainment medium, for example, depending on who's writing what and where, is dictated by the author's sense of creativity, as they might have creative free flow and anatomy for a depiction of a certain character depending on where they work at. For example, Scott Snyder, who is famous for writing and creating Batman New 52, introducing readers into the organization known as the Court of Owls, the Batman who laughs, and is partially responsible responsible for the on-screen adaptation of the DC Extended Universe Batfleck that is seen in movies. Not the idea that he kills people, but the idea that this particular Batman exists. This is completely different and contradictory to Grant Morrison, who introduces Batman's son, Damian Wayne, into the story in the DC Universe, while showcasing a Batman that almost comes off as an unstably insane genius, and Tom King's Batman that is littered with horrendous writing, low sales, and a Bruce Wayne that is so sad his depression goes on for over 50 single-story issues. Admittedly, you could say these are reinterpretations of the characters depending on who the writer is and was. Scott Snyder is not Grant Morrison isn't Tom King, none of them are related. However, the character that they do write is related and shares similar characteristics besides the Tom King version. For example, Scott Snyder's and Grant Morrison's Batmans that has an intelligence that rivals God, while Tom King's Batman is, well, a moron. But what does this have to do with Stanley Parables, you might wonder? Batman, written by Grant Morrison and Scott Snyder, has been critically received by fans and critics, with people praising stories like Death of the Family by Scott Snyder and Batman and Son by Morrison, while Batman City of Bane by Tom King is both pretentious and a horrific mutilation of what the character was. However, because of their success, and when I say their success, I'm talking about Snyder and Morrison, the relationship between the writers, the fans, and the DC editorial team was prosperous, with Morrison and Snyder writing Batman for a very, very long time. Tom King, on the other hand, is a completely different story. His Batman book is so bad and divided fans so much that DC editorial apparently had to kick him off the book, as he was being outsold by both the Hulk and Squirrel Girl. How are you gonna get outsold by Squirrel Girl? But what does this have to do with the Stanley Parables? I bring this up because it significantly screwed over other writers, creating a massive dissonance between the readers and the characters because the writer bent the character around a pencil to justify nonsensical plot lines. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it is. In Stanley's Parable, you can follow the narrator's instructions and receive a happy ending, or you can go against those instructions, creating your own narrative, as the narrator tries to compensate a story with your actions, which creates a new story or a completely another plot line that he originally didn't plan for, or did he? In the case of Tom King's Batman, the LOL it's random shenanigans and the absolute travesty of Dick Grayson Nightwing getting his brains blown out, with his last words being about a character named Napkin Man, who doesn't even exist within the DC universe, then getting his brains blown out, was a complete travesty to the editorial team, other authors, and fans. Why? Because it came completely out of left field. There was no build up to it. It was completely random, and it just happened for no apparent reason. Or did it? Or did Tom King plan it that way? Either way, of course, this patronized fans and other writers. But what does this have to do with the Stanley Parables, you might ask? Well, this should all sound pretty familiar to you. What happens when you divert from the plan? What happens when you divert and do your own thing? In the case of the Nightwing book, a shock value gimmick was used to boost sales, an extension blowing a character's brains out, then giving them amnesia in an attempt to sell more books. But don't worry, this was all a part of the plan. This was a part of the plan so much that the writer at the time, who was concurrently writing Nightwing, refused to play around with this architect or narrator and refused to write Nightwing, ending issues of build-up and story arcs for the sake of someone else's agenda. Thus, the book was put on hiatus and another writer had to step in and pick up the slack. And when I say everything the prior author was writing ended, I mean everything. Prior supporting characters vanished, prior antagonists that were doing evil things for pretty enigmatic reasons vanished, romantic partners magically disappeared to never be heard of ever again. Thus, Dick Grayson Nightwing was soft rebooted into a character now titled Rick Grayson, which nobody really likes and something completely out of the author's control, all because one person wanted to blow another character's brains out for no apparent reason, thus making a new narrative that doesn't really make sense and comes completely out of nowhere. A more extreme example of this is the New 52's iteration of Batwoman, the Jewish and lesbianic superheroine Catherine Kane, who is related to Batman, which sold gangbusters under the writing and narrative direction of J.H. Williams. The book that spanned about 27 issues until the writer wanted to surprisingly end the story arc with Batwoman, Catherine Kane, getting married to another woman, which the story was obviously building up to, until DC editorial said hold up and began shaking their heads and said that ain't happening, which led to writer J.H. Williams refusing to write another story arc, which led him to be replaced because of creative differences, thus creating a divergent narrative from J.H. Williams, where DC proceeded to write a story where Batwoman blows up her relationship with her fiancé and proceeds to get raped and literally eaten out sexually and physically by her vampire girlfriend, because of course they did, and that made perfect sense, which nobody liked. And guess what? The book got cancelled. Now, despite how irrelevant this all must sound, Stanley's Parable is a tad more complicated yet simple simultaneously. If I told you that if Stanley walked through the left door, Batwoman would be married to Renee Montoya and live happily ever after, while I said the right door would cause something more dramatic to happen, would you still go left or choose right, knowing that right would lead to a horrifically bad ending? Sure, the left door gives you clarity. It gives you an answer to what will happen, while the right door is a journey into a possible horrific narrative that was conceived last minute, because of course it was, because you didn't listen, so a story had to be made on the fly. But it's still a journey into a mystery that could be somewhat interesting. What do you choose? Like I've said, Stanley's Parable is about the conflict between the storyteller and the player. Thus the question becomes, does the player follow the storyteller and play the game as intended like a good dog, or go on their own path creating their own story? Given the Tom King example and the Batwoman example, creating your own story can lead to some pretty tragic results. The game Alan Wake explores this idea with the writer you play as literally playing through and trying to change a story he wrote but can't remember, and the plot twist is he's narrating it. While Spec Ops: The Line plays with the same idea, with the player becoming aware that the game truly ended after the first mission was completed in the first 20 minutes of the game, making the following 7 hours unnecessary, which a revelation slapped to the end of the story, it changes the entire story itself, warping the perception of reality that the player told existed, as the story itself goes to a place that the storyteller likes but the player does not like because what they've been implicated in. And with that revelation, the player is finally able to truly interact with the events of the story, with the player given two genuine choices.
I know the truth is hard to hear, Walker, but it's time. You're all that's left, and we can't live this lie forever. I'm going to count to 5, then I'm pulling the trigger.
You're not real. This is all in my head.
Everything. All this. It was your fault. If that's what you believe, then shoot me.
Spec Ops: The Line is an extreme example of where the storyteller becomes the main character's greatest enemy while being his greatest friends, but if you do nothing and let the story choose for you, or let everything naturally play out of how it was scripted and intended to end the story, Walker kills himself. If the player intervenes, you either get the John Rambo Dubai ending or the ending where you go home, but assumably that's probably a hallucination, who knows. But to reiterate on my point,
This isn't possible.
Oh, I assure you, it is. How? Not how. Why? You were never meant to come here.
We have our orders. Leave the city, radio command from outside the storm wall. They send in the cavalry, we go home. What happened here was out of my control.
Was it? None of this would have happened if you just stopped. None of this would have happened if you just stopped. None of this would have happened if you just stopped. None of this would have happened if you just stopped. None of this would have happened if you just stopped.
what all three of these games emphasize heavily on over all things is choice. Choice for and against the narrator and the story itself. The ending I showed you at the start of the video shows the outcome of someone who does not choose. That though the narrator is all-seeing and all-knowing, it can't do all things, meaning we need him as much as he needs us. It doesn't bother the narrator that we choose wrong or right, but what hurts more is when someone does not choose, thereby revealing how helpless the narrator is without our input, disregarding our humanity for something that is less than, for something that he is, which is a god that created their own personal hell, sucking out all the joy and fun for both he and his creation. The story behind Stanley's Parable is oversimplistic. Stanley is an analogy for the player, as he himself at the start of the game is doing exactly what the player is doing, sitting at a computer and pressing buttons that are on display on screen, waiting for the next set of instructions, until Stanley notices he hasn't received instructions for a long time, which then prompts him to begin hearing the voice of the narrator in his head, which instructs him, giving meaning to its existence, in addition to ours. If you travel along the yellow brick road listening to the man in your head, you'll discover that your boss went on an insane power trip where he has begun using mind control to manipulate everyone in the office. After turning off the machine, your character is able to escape the facility and assumably live a happy, normal life. That's the end of the game if you follow the instructions of the narrator. But what happens if you don't? Shenanigans. You begin to make your own story while the narrator tries to make up a story that justifies your narrative that you create diverting from the narrator's story, which results in one of two outcomes. By some miracle, Stanley escapes or death. Then it begins to start this paradoxical loop that happens over and over and over and over and over again. The answer is yes, this game is about choice and fate, but because video games are scripted events that occur within a sequence, there is no amount of free will that can exist within a video game because it's all designed. This game gives you an illusion that your choices matter by having a dozen or so endings, yet they are all just scriptable branches of code that execute when conditions are met. The only real choice you have within this game is not to play at all, creating the paradox which brings Stanley into existence. You have to play, and even if you win, you still lose. And the examples I gave earlier, in Batwoman's case, the editorial team didn't like the direction of the story, even though it was building to a natural conclusion or an additional arc, and receiving raving reviews until it sank like the Titanic with a rapey vampiric relationship for no reason, creating their own narrative diverting from the original architect's design, which in turn led to the book's cancellation and a dissonance between the fans and the creative team behind the book and DC editorial staff. And much like in Stanley's Parables, when another godlike narrator begins interfering with the progression of how a story was supposed to go, it suffers drastically from it creating an ever-expanding collateral damage from its original archetype until it all comes crashing down. Like that time Batwoman and Catwoman got married, which the author kept saying it was going to happen until both characters left one another at the altar, and made all the spin-off books completely irrelevant, meaning that if you bought them, you wasted your money. But before I go, let me explain this one more time. Stanley's Parable is an exploration between the storyteller and the player and how a choice can be an illusion to an artificially happy ending or outcome, but it also explores the consequences of having things go your way instead of the way the narrator intended. The most literal interpretation of what I'm saying comes true in the fact that there is an entire level designed as a museum outlining how this was all built, as the player can see the architect designs for the rooms he's supposed to go to, making his entire life meaningless because it's all done by design. But the worst fact about this revelation is the very fact that the player discovers the narrator has a narrator, thus making the events of the game preordained, which in turn makes Stanley dead at the moment that you began playing the game. But returning to the ending showcased at the start of the video, in my opinion, it's the only outcome that can exist when there is a dissonance between the player and a godlike narrator. The player chooses to do nothing or quit, or the storyteller becomes discontent with the player, lack a choice because we can't exist without one another. No matter the outcome or where the story goes, we need each other for things to work. The narrator needs the player needs the narrator, fate can't exist without people, and people can't exist without fate. It's paradoxical, and there's nothing we can do to end the loop because we willingly participate in it, because we want to. Isn't that right, Stanley?